Hi. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ilyana Kuziemko. I'm the director of the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies. Um, and one of my favorite tasks as director is hosting our book talks, and this book talk is no exception. I'm very excited to welcome Osita Nwanevu here to Princeton. Osita's been a contributing editor at the New Republic. I have read in the New Republic with great pleasure his essays over the years, and was very excited when I learned that he would be writing a book. So we have him here to talk about this book, The Right of the People, Democracy, and the Case for a New American Founding. This really couldn't come at a more opportune moment when I think a lot of Americans are contemplating the strength of democratic principles in their own countries, in their own country. Beyond this book and beyond his work at the New Republic, he is a columnist at The Guardian, and he has written in The New Yorker, Slate, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The Nation, Harper's, among other places. So Osita's going to talk for, I believe, about 30 to 40 minutes. I'll kick it off with some prepared questions, and then we'll open it to everybody else. And then I should remind you that Osita will be signing books, and we have books for purchase as well after the book talk. So Osita, the floor is yours, and I'll look forward to starting things off.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here at Princeton, and I'm especially honored and grateful to be here at the invitation of both Princeton Politics and I guess the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies, given that I'm pretty far afield from being an economist. As a political journalist, though, I've been given a lot of opportunity over the last decade or so to consider the meaning of democracy, which is the actual subject of this book. So I started The Right of the People in the summer of 2021, and though I couldn't have directly predicted that the state of democracy in America would be one of the defining issues of the last presidential election, it wasn't exactly a surprise to me. Donald Trump was first elected in 2016, of course, by electoral college victory, despite losing the popular vote. It's the second time already in this young century that that's happened. And that predictably inspired renewed conversation about the health of America's political institutions and constitutional order. And the events of Trump's first term in office, which culminated in the effort to overturn the 2020 election and the January 6th attack on Congress, only intensified the alarm of progressives like myself. In 2024, the Biden and Harris campaigns did all that they could to remind voters of those events and underscore the threats they believe Donald Trump posed to democracy. And that November, a plurality of voters, having heard those arguments, went to the polls and re-elected Donald Trump, granting him the second time around the first popular vote victory for a Republican candidate in 20 years. So clearly, Democratic messaging on saving democracy failed. And I think it failed for two reasons. The first is that many Americans don't seem to believe we have a democracy that's worth saving to begin with. In late 2023, Gallup reported that 71% of Americans were dissatisfied with the way American democracy was working, the highest level of dissatisfaction on record since they began asking the question in 1984. Surveys also tell us that just 19% of Americans believe democracy in America is a good example for other countries to follow. And they also tell us that nearly half of Americans believe American democracy does a poor job of representing the interests of ordinary people. So given all of that, staking a campaign on protecting and respecting America's existing political institutions and framing the defense of democracy as a defense of those institutions was suicidally misguided. It should have been obvious. Many of the Americans Democrats need to win over most have taken an interest in Donald Trump precisely because he's promised radical departures from political norms and a political order that they believe has failed them. But the second reason I think Democratic messaging on saving a democracy failed, the reason that might be of most interest to all of you here today, is that Democrats framed democracy as an abstraction at a remove from the economic concerns of most voters. Polls showed conclusively that inflation and the cost of living weighed on the minds of most voters more heavily than any other issue. And every time Democrats urged voters to reject Donald Trump purely as a matter of principle, given his attacks on the democratic process and his violations of democratic norms, they stacked the deck against themselves. Democracy, they implied, was a set of ideals that had to be weighed against material interests, a set of notions one might dimly remember having been tutored in a civics class, set against the price of groceries, rent, mortgage payments, and so on. And in the end, a critical share of voters wound up choosing the candidate who, unseemly and undemocratic as he might have been, they came to believe would improve the economy. My intuitions here, of course, are contestable, and I welcome other analyses. But if they're correct, the 2024 election offers important lessons for us small d Democrats, the foremost and most obvious of which is that we cannot presume the American people shares common understanding of what democracy is, why democracy is important, and where democracy fits into the larger web of matters we're forced to confront in our lives and in our society. Simply put, too many of us deeply involved and invested in politics have come to take democracy for granted. Obviously, that leaves democratic politics especially vulnerable at a time when prominent political figures, especially on the right, from pundits like the late Charlie Kirk to Utah Senator Mike Lee, have come to denigrate democracy more and more openly. Democracy, Lee wrote in the final weeks before the 2020 election, isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that. But as troubled as many here might be by the increasingly anti-democratic character of the right in politics today, Lee's ambivalence and skepticism about democracy has also been shared by many political scientists, political theorists, economists, and philosophers. The truth is that those of us committed to defending democracy have more work cut out for us than we tend to acknowledge. You wouldn't know it reading most of the op-eds and columns of the last decade, but democracy is extraordinarily complicated, a frustrating, maddening, mathematically vexing thicket of ideas. And there is real danger in a political discourse that presumes the case for democracy is simple and obvious. It is neither. To take democracy for granted as an ideal is to leave it vulnerable. We're going to have a hard time defending democracy if we can't define it. And we'll surely fail to restore confidence in democracy if we can't engage and defeat its critics head-on. But conversely, clearing that basic ground might leave us a better understanding of what democracy might still be able to do for us. In the book, I argue that's actually much more than we've encouraged to imagine. All told, the book advances three propositions. The first is that democracy, properly defined, is good. The second is that America is not, and never has been, a democracy. And the third is that America should become a democracy through the transformation of not only our political institutions, but the American economy. A gradual transition significant enough in scale that we might as well consider it a new founding. Now, that language is derived from the work of the historian Eric Foner, who has argued that the post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution fundamentally altered the country's existing political order. It is the right of the people, the Declaration of Independence tells us, to make such fundamental alterations and institute new government when our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are existentially threatened. And it is my belief today, 250 years after the first American founding, we find ourselves in precisely such a position again. As such, the book makes a case for a new founding, embarking on the long project of truly fulfilling the promise of American democracy. The first of our tasks, though, is answering a simple question. What is democracy, anyhow? The briefest answer I've been able to devise is that democracy is a system in which the governed govern. Governance isn't supposed to be given over to some king or some class of elites with no reason or responsibility to represent the interests of many. In a democracy, those who are subject to governance are the ones who themselves do the governing in some fashion. Or, to borrow Lincoln's plain English from the Gettysburg Address, democracies are governments of the people, by the people, and for the people. Different systems aim for that ideal in different ways, and arguments about what kinds of institutions best embody it have been ongoing for centuries. But Lincoln offers us a definition of democracy we can work with. In a democracy, the people rule. The governed govern, and power, as Pericles and Lincoln alike would have agreed, is wielded by and for the many rather than the few. That understanding of what democracy is about, as rough as it is, should help us answer another basic question. What's so great about democracy anyway? For me, and perhaps for most, the case for democracy is built upon a basic intuition. We, the people, should govern because the people are entitled to a measure of control over the conditions that shape their lives. Rather than being the helpless victims of circumstance, or the obedient subjects of a powerful few, democratic self-governance lets us act in our own direction, being, in the words of theorist James Lindley Wilson, co-author with others of one's life and world, without masters and without minders. It is to democracy's credit that it's had many visionaries like John Dewey and Walt Whitman, willing to speak on its behalf in those terms. But whatever one chooses to believe spiritually, metaphysically, or philosophically about why democracy matters normatively and what it might do for us, there's also a practical affirmative case for it. Democracy offers us three key tools that should help us govern society as well. The first is agency. We get to decide what our problems are and how we ought to fix them, rather than waiting for some higher, perhaps alien authority to take an interest in solving them. The second is dynamism. Democracies are good at generating change. Each democratic contest offers a moment when the people can evaluate old ways of doing things and try new ones. Judgments are made, previously chosen leaders and policies are evaluated and perhaps switched out. The most innovative and reform-minded authoritarians we might imagine still wouldn't be nearly as dynamic as a political system where competition and evaluation are built in and no leader is above replacement. And the third tool, related to the second, is procedure. Democracies offer us stable, formal ways to make collective decisions and resolve disputes. As rough as politics can get, we're still better off having democratic debates over the issues rather than clashes in the streets. And while the tensions of democratic competition can obviously spill out in disorder and violence in broken societies, or places where democratic values have been weakened, democracy can help tame conflict when procedures are fair, routine, understood, and accessible. Under those conditions, even those who have good reasons to stick with the system, even those who lose have good reasons to stick with the system. They'll get another shot in the next election or in another forum. For some theorists, this specific dynamic, institutionalized uncertainty about the future, as some call it, is what democracy is fundamentally about. The knowledge that particular alignments of power will be challenged in fair processes and likely won't last forever. Our second question, given all this, how do we know that a given system is democratic? In my life, there are three things to look for. The first is political equality. In democracies, all who come to a collective choice do so in equal standing. There are no privileged minorities. Otherwise, systems leave themselves open to governance by a privileged few, rather than the people governing as a whole. The second is responsiveness. Democracy is not a suggestion box. When people act collectively in democracies, things do happen. They might not happen directly or immediately, but democratic systems are meaningfully responsive in some fashion to the governing public. Lastly, democracies are characterized by majority rule. Of all the decision rules we might utilize to make a collective choice, from unanimity all the way down to some form of minority rule, majority rule is a decision rule consistent with the principle of equality. If two people want one thing and three people want some other thing, the two can't get their way over the three unless there's some kind of underlying inequality involved. Now, majority rule gets vastly more complicated than this. Everything I've said gets vastly more complicated than I've been able to speak to. But I do think the book does a reasonable enough job of working through the complexities to ground its central assertion that America is not, in fact, a democracy. American people are not equal as political subjects. When majorities successfully compete for power, our political system is often unresponsive to them. Even when the system responds, the victories won through political contestation can be overturned by the machinations of the wealthy, major corporations, and their allies within our political institutions. And those victories are undermined, too, by the power corporations and the wealthy wield over us within the economy, including at work. It might be argued that the same can be said of most putatively democratic societies in the world today. That thus far, we've occupied ourselves with a democratic ideal that can never fully be met. That might be true. Still, I think our democracy falls far further from the ideal than the governments of our peers do in many respects. And in calling them democracies, I don't think we subject the concept to quite as much abuse. To call America a democracy is to strain the word beyond meaning. In doing so, we include basic and remediable defects in our institutions. So I think many of those who follow politics closely here probably heard a lot about some of those defects, from the design of the Senate all the way through the need for campaign finance reform. But today I'd like to focus on one of the central provocations of the book, which is, again, the state of the American economy and the structures within it also demands democratic attention. It's a conclusion formed by the principles just outlined. Again, democracy is a system in which the governed govern. And many who support democracy share the intuition that it's desirable because it gives us a measure of control over the conditions that shape our lives. This rendering of democracy and why it's important, though, should raise questions we don't ask ourselves often enough. Where else in life beyond our political institutions are we governed? And where else in life might we hope to exercise more control over our basic conditions? For me, the economic realm comes first to mind. We spend roughly a third of our lives at work. We and those who depend on us derive our livelihoods from that time. And the decisions made at the top of companies often affect us more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C. and our other seats of government. Yet most of us take it entirely for granted that most economic decision-making should be left to shareholders and executives. We are fundamentally entitled to a real say about our working lives, or about the wider economy beyond the votes we cast in a political system that also happens to be dominated by the wealthy. Those of us committed to democracy tend to believe that cooks and cashiers and warehouse workers are democratically entitled to having their voices heard on the full range of policy issues that come up for discussion within our politics, from local zoning laws all the way up through our relations with Russia or Iran. We also take it entirely for granted. The workers should be mostly excluded from decision-making on how their own workplaces are run. In places, circumstances, and settings they know best, in which they are arguably the most qualified to assess situations and make decisions, sociologist Isabel Ferreras writes, workers become subordinates. In recent years, attention has been the subject of renewed interest from many democratic theorists and political philosophers, including Elizabeth Anderson, who notes in her 2017 book, Private Government, that we've come to accept a level of unaccountable control in our workplaces that we would never accept from a state. Consider some facts, she writes, about how employers today control their workers. Walmart prohibits employees from exchanging casual remarks while on duty, calling this time theft. Apple inspects the personal belongings of their retail workers, who lose up to a half hour of unpaid time every day as they wait in line to be searched. Tyson prevents its poultry workers from using the bathroom. Some have been forced to urinate on themselves while their supervisors mock them. About half of U.S. employees have been subject to suspicionless drug screening by their employers. Millions are pressured by their employers to support particular political causes or candidates. If the U.S. government imposed such regulations on us, we would rightly protest that our constitutional rights are being violated. But American workers have no such rights against their bosses. Even speaking out against such constraints can get them fired, so most keep silent. Normatively, conditions like this, rising economic inequality, and the democratic principles I've outlined give us ample reason to consider the possibilities of economic democracy, granting ordinary people more agency and authority within the economy, including within the workplace. So economic democracy is a phrase and concept that can be put to many ends. But labor power, the agency and authority workers are able to exercise within the economy, I think has to be part of the equation. And for a time, thanks to the labor movement, the American economy did give workers an amount of agency and authority that has since declined dramatically. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, better known as the Wagner Act, guaranteed most private sector workers the right to organize and bargain for better pay and working conditions. As a result, union membership spiked. In the 12 years after its enactment, nearly 11 million Americans joined unions. In 1935, about 13% of the country's workforce had been unionized. By 1955, that proportion jumped to roughly one-third of American workers. And beyond working to get the American people better working conditions and wages at work, unions also used that newfound strength to push the New Deal and Great Society agendas forward. All told, they played a significant role in ensuring that the gains for our economic growth flowed to workers, not just the already wealthy. According to one 2021 paper, one I believe Ilyana worked on actually, increasing union membership alone likely explains nearly a quarter of the decline in American inequality between 1936 and 1968. And while union families earned about 10 to 20% more in income than non-union families between the 1940s and the 2010s, unions also made non-union workers better off than they otherwise would have been. To compete with union workplaces for new hires and to keep their employees content, even non-union workplaces wound up offering better pay and working conditions. But in the 1970s, American policymakers began a consequential departure from the New Deal and Great Society economic order. The labor movement was tamed, taxes were slashed, government programs were gutted, government functions were privatized, industries were deregulated, jobs were enthusiastically sent overseas, and finance took up a greater share of our economic activity. And while the American people are more prosperous today than they were 50 years ago, the wealthy have gained quite disproportionately from that agenda. So the productivity of our economy has grown by 111% since the mid-1970s. The hourly pay of the median American worker has increased by only 50% during that time, after roughly a quarter century of tracking productivity closely. Meanwhile, Americans at the top of the income distribution have seen their earnings skyrocket. From 1979 to 2022, according to analysts at the Economic Policy Institute, annual earnings for the top 1% of Americans grew by nearly 172%. Earnings for the top 10th of 1% of Americans, meanwhile, grew by more than 344%. And the nation's top executives naturally have done the best of all. In the same period, pay for the CEOs of 350 largest companies on the stock market grew by more than 1,200%. The average CEO now makes 344 times more than the average worker, compared to just 21 times more back in 1965. Now, these are among the reasons why the OECD now ranks the United States among the worst of the countries it studies on income inequality. We're 34th, behind Bulgaria and Turkey. And our inequalities in overall wealth are even starker. The top 10% of American households, those with an average net worth of about $6.9 million, now own about 67% of the household wealth in this country. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of American households, worth about $51,000 on average, have less than 3% of our household wealth. Between 2007 and 2016 alone, which included the Great Recession and its immediate aftermath, the wealth of the median American family fell by more than $40,000, as one might expect. But the wealth of the top 1% of Americans actually grew by nearly $5 million on average. That owed largely to increases in the value of stock. While most Americans own some securities, nearly 93% of them are owned by the top 10% of Americans. When the financial markets do well, so do Americans rich enough to play the markets in the first place. Off of Wall Street, though, Americans who truly work for a living, the majority who depend on a wage or a salary, whose most valuable assets might be the roofs over their heads, if they happen to own them, have had a much harder time building and maintaining wealth, especially racial minorities. And that's substantially a product of how the American economy has been remade over the last few decades. And few internal changes were as dramatic or as consequential as the fall of the labor movement. From its peak of about 1/3 of the American workforce in the 1940s and 1950s, union membership has declined to about 10% of the workforce today, including just 6% of the private sector workforce. According to one estimate, the decline in union membership since 1968 accounts for about 10% of the increase in income inequality America has seen since then. According to another, when the impact on the hourly wages on non-union members is factored in, the decline of unions likely explains as much as 1/5 of the rise of wage inequality among American women and 1/3 among American men working in the private sector between 1973 and 2007. Now, that rise in inequality, again, sits atop bad conditions for many American workers in the workplace, as Elizabeth Anderson describes. To be sure, most Americans aren't facing the conditions of Tyson poultry workers or even Amazon warehouse workers. And surveys show few Americans actively hate their jobs. But that doesn't mean workers don't deserve better. The United States, for instance, is one of only 6 countries in the entire world, and the sole wealthy nation, that lacks any national paid leave policy. On average, countries around the world guarantee around 25 weeks of paid maternity leave for new mothers and 16 weeks of paid paternity leave for new fathers. The United States guarantees 0. 71% of the world's countries require employers to provide at least 12 weeks of paid sick leave. The United States requires none. Instead, federal law guarantees up to 12 weeks of unpaid family or medical leave, a policy that, due to exclusions based on business side and certain eligibility requirements, does not cover a staggering 44% of American workers. 73% of American workers in the private sector don't have paid family leave, and nearly 1/4 of them lack even paid sick time. In one 2019 survey, Gallup asked workers to rate their jobs across 10 dimensions, not just pay, but hours, job security, benefits, their sense of purpose at work, and their capacity to change aspects of their job they disliked. After using those results to form a measure of job quality, the survey found that 60% of Americans are working in mediocre or bad jobs based on their own reported satisfaction and job priorities. And workers' ability to meaningfully improve their jobs is, of course, deeply constrained not only by right-to-work laws and other means of preventing labor organization, but by at-will employment. Workers who speak out about their conditions can easily be fired because in the vast majority of workplaces not covered by union contract, and in every state save Montana, workers are hired at will. That means that employers can legally fire them for nearly any reason not explicitly prohibited by labor law, or indeed for no reason at all. The United States is virtually the only country in the world where this is the case. Just about everywhere else, employers have to demonstrate cause for firings. The employee being dismissed has either done something wrong or must be let go for financial reasons or other difficult circumstances. In the United States, by contrast, you can be fired simply because your boss is having a bad day. And even the workers fired for an illegal reason, racial or gender discrimination, for example, or trying to organize a union, may be unable to take their employers to court. A 56% majority of the non-union private sector workforce and 65% of workers making less than $13 an hour are bound by so-called mandatory arbitration clauses, often tucked into the documents signed when one takes a job, that surrender their right to bring a legal dispute about their work. Instead, they must settle with their employer through a private arbitrator, a process where they're less likely to succeed. And even if they do prevail, less likely to win less in damages than they would in court. That makes it easier for employers to get away with the kinds of abuses and poor working conditions that Anderson and others have examined. It also facilitates outright income theft. Wages stolen by employers, it's been estimated, may cost minimum wage workers in America as much as $15 billion a year. And even disgruntled workers who leave their jobs might be barred from seeking similar alternatives by non-compete agreements, provisions that prevent a worker from immediately taking the same job at another company. According to the Federal Trade Commission, which tried to ban non-competes in the 2024 rule that was blocked in court, roughly 1 in 5 Americans have been subject to such agreements. As much as companies try to maximize the leverage and power they hold over their employees, it's often most profitable, of course, for them to outsource the labor to workers who aren't actually theirs at all. Temporary and contract hires can be employed more cheaply and as needed. This fishing of the workforce, as labor experts call it, has swept the American economy over the last few decades. And it can make it difficult for workers to understand who they're working for and who they should approach about a job issue. One might go to work at a particular workplace for a company while being employed, technically, by another company hired by the first. Fully independent contractors employed directly as individuals by companies don't necessarily fare any better. They can be paid less than employees for the same amount of work, are entitled to the same benefits, and lack the right to unionize. That goes a long way towards explaining why, according to one study, as many as 30% of employers in America misclassify their employees as contractors, some intentionally and illegally. All told, these issues, and the decline of unions, and the democratic agency they offered, have left workers with less power across the economy to demand and negotiate for better pay and working conditions. That explains a substantial proportion of the rise of inequality that America has seen over the past several decades. Larger and larger shares of the economic gains that workers produce have gone to executives and investors. As I also explore in the book, their influence over politics and policy outcomes their growing wealth buys them is an obstacle to fully realizing even political democracy in America. So what's to be done? There are 3 areas of economic policy recommendation at the end of the book. The first is labor policy. In recent years, unions and their advocates have been united in supporting the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, the most significant piece of proposed legislation for organized labor since the Wagner Act. An override of state right-to-work laws, a ban on forced anti-union meetings at work, a ban on permanently replacing striking workers, a ban on forcing employees to waive their right ban on forcing employees, to waive their right to class action lawsuits, civil penalties for violations of the Wagner Act, etc. These and the PRO Act's other provisions will be pretty transformative, making it easier to organize unions, bolstering the power, and extending new protections to all workers, both union and non-union. But still more could be done. Federal labor law can be changed so that a union is automatically formed and recognized by the NLRB once a majority of employees is given in a given unit, sign cards authorizing one, without the need for a separate election. Additionally, federal labor law should fully cover public employees, agricultural, and domestic workers who have been outside the Wagner Act's protections. We should also end at-will employment by establishing that workers can be fired only for just cause, a reform that would not only grant American workers a basic protection afforded to nearly all other workers in the world, but would also facilitate the formation of unions by making it more difficult for employers to invent reasons for firing union organizers and supportive employees. It should also be established that federal labor law, once reworked, should be the floor for labor protections in this country rather than the ceiling. States and localities should be allowed to pass labor laws of their own, provided that they are at least as protective of unions as federal law is. Policymakers could also more fundamentally transform labor law by instituting sectoral bargaining, a system in which representatives of employers and unions come together to negotiate over and set basic paying conditions for workers across entire sectors of the economy all at once. On bargaining panels, those representatives might craft and vote on agreements that, for example, set a minimum wage and benefits package for all retail workers in a given state or region, rather than waiting for workers to organize unions and negotiate contracts store by store. New unions at each workplace could then focus on negotiating issues specific to each workplace, or to try to push for even better paying conditions than the minimums established by the bargaining panels. Sectoral bargaining has a number of advantages beyond being a quicker and easier way to improve things for workers than traditional union organizing. For one thing, companies might be less resistant to improving paying conditions for workers if all of their competitors were made to do the same in a sectoral agreement. As matters stand now, one reason companies fight hard against unions is that they fear spending more on their workers will put them at a competitive disadvantage against their rivals. For another thing, sectoral agreements could address fishing by protecting all workers doing the same kind of work, whether they're full employees or working within the gig economy. Now, some potential precursors to sectoral bargaining agreements have cropped up in recent years. Since 2018, 6 states and 3 cities have set up industry standards boards, including California's Fast Food Council, which can set minimum wage increases and draft proposals on working conditions that be expedited into law, and Minnesota's Nursing Home Workforce Standards Board, which has raised the minimum wage for nursing home workers, guaranteed paid holidays, and also has the power to make proposals that can be expedited into law. Efforts like these should be expanded and made more fully democratic, allowing for the election of work representatives by workers themselves, on the way to true sectoral bargaining in America. Now, the second area where the book offers recommendations is corporate governance. While giving more workers the power to negotiate over pay and working conditions by expanding and transforming labor law would go some way to building that democratic agency, bargaining is not governing. Beyond the basic conditions set by law or union contracts, most workers have little to no voice over a great many decisions that could upend their lives or dramatically affect the way they work. Factories and shops and offices get shuttered, layoffs get handed down, business strategies are fundamentally changed, and projects get pushed along that pose far more risks for workers if they fail than they do for their bosses. For the most part in America, workers who make possible everything the companies do get no say on most of these matters, and likely wouldn't, even if unions were strengthened and we additionally moved towards sectoral bargaining. Here again, policymakers should take a page from Europe, this time with reforms that would give workers a direct say in business decisions. One such reform would be to have businesses institute works councils, bodies of representatives elected by workers that are consulted on working conditions, firings and layoffs, and other matters directly affecting employees' lives at works. While councils in most countries are merely informed of certain impending decisions, a few countries have given their councils a degree of real authority. In Sweden, for instance, work councils actively influence decisions on working conditions and have set up educational programs for the workers. And in Germany, councils can even overturn dismissals of workers they deem unjust. Contrary to what skeptics might assume about the business sense of granting worker representatives that much power, research suggests that worker councils generally have little to no impact on firm profitability. If anything, they may increase productivity, perhaps by offering workers forums in which they can discuss and solve problems. That makes them a good supplement for traditional unions. Works councils can address new or specific issues in the workplace atop the contracts that unions have already negotiated, and they can offer workers a voice in workplaces where a union is yet to be organized. Workers should also be given democratic power at much higher echelons of corporate governance. In some countries, companies are required under an arrangement known as codetermination to reserve for their workers a portion of their seats on the governing board, ensuring that ordinary employees get at least some say in decisions that might otherwise be left wholly to executives and investors. Germany's system is perhaps the most well-known and widely studied. There, most companies with 500 to 2,000 employees are required to have their workers elect 1/3 of the supervisory board that chooses and manages the executives running the company. Most companies with at least 2,000 employees are required to have workers elect 1/2 of their board. And as with works councils, research suggests that firms with codetermination are as or more productive than others. In recent years, a few new proposals inspired by European codetermination schemes have been proposed by major politicians here. In 2018, Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin introduced a bill that would have required all corporations on the stock market to let workers elect at least 1/3 of their board of directors. This was followed by presidential campaign proposals from Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Warren would have required companies collecting at least $1 billion in revenue to let workers elect 40% of their boards. Sanders would have had all companies on the stock market, as well as companies with at least $100 million in assets and revenue, let workers elect 45% of their boards. Either way, the Warren and Sanders proposals would have applied to companies employing roughly 30 million workers. So under the Baldwin, Warren, and Sanders plans, employee power would obviously be limited. As is just about universal in all codetermination schemes, worker representatives would only have a minority of seats on each board. Even in most large German companies where worker representatives make half of supervisory boards, deadlocks are resolved by the representatives of shareholders. But still, granting workers elected seats at the table where corporate decisions are made would significantly empower them. Even with a minority of seats, worker representatives could deeply influence corporate governance by casting key votes on issues where other board members might be split, and ensuring that matters important to workers are at least raised for discussion. And they could use that influence to help bolster the democratic power of workers elsewhere, by pushing back against company efforts to discourage or frustrate union organizing, for instance, or by trying to rein in political contributions to anti-union candidates and groups. But even if the workers were on their boards, companies would still be fundamentally accountable to those who owned them, founders, executives, and anyone else owning company shares. For public companies, that includes Wall Street investors who buy and profit from stock stolen in the markets without contributing anything whatsoever to a company's operations and success. Corporate shareholders are entitled to vote on corporate matters, including selecting company board members, and the dividends that boards decide to pay out. And companies' actual employees, on the other hand, are generally entitled to none of this. Unless their employers are generous, they earn nothing more from their wealth their work produces, from their pay and benefits. No shares or income as their companies do well, no votes as shareholders. So given this, the book offers reforms in one last area, corporate ownership. Simply put, workers should also be owners, entitled to an ownership stake in the companies that they work for. Some already are. The supermarket chain Publix, for instance, one of the top 10 largest private U.S. companies, is fully owned by its 250,000 employees. Other notable private companies owned in large part by the workers include King Arthur Flour, the manufacturer W.L. Gore, and Wawa. For years now, the primary vehicle for achieving ownership at a large scale in the United States has been the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or an ESOP. In an ESOP, a company's stock is gathered from various sources and placed in a trust for employees who receive an allocation of shares that the company can buy back for them once they retire. But while there are a number of benefits to that model, it isn't especially democratic. Very few ESOPs allow workers to vote just as normal shareholders do. So in 2019, Bernie Sanders proposed another democratically promising and ambitious model for worker ownership, inspired by an idea floated by the UK's Labour Party. Under his plan, the federal government would pass a law requiring all companies on the stock market and all companies with at least $100 million in revenue or on their balance sheets to establish what he called democratic employee ownership funds, controlled by worker-elected trustees. Each company would then gradually place 20% of its stock into its fund over 10 years. And workers at each company would have the right to vote through their portions of stock in the fund, just like any other shareholders. Sanders' fund would also hold a number of key material advantages over ESOPs. Shares in an ESOP cannot be sold, meaning that workers don't earn anything from the ESOP, for the most part, unless they leave their companies or retire. But shares in the Sanders fund, though similarly held in a trust, would pay out stock dividends to workers during their actual employment. At the same time, they'd avoid a major pitfall with ESOPs, which is that they leave employee retirement plans in jeopardy if their companies go under. Keeping employee shares in the trust that pays out dividends, by contrast, provides a layer of insulation that allows workers to hold investments in their companies without becoming too ensnared in their financial woes. In plainer terms, Sanders' plan would have given workers ownership and control over 20% of every major company in the country, every big corporation you've heard of, and thousands more besides, employing some 56 million Americans. And their ownership stakes would entitle workers to both full voting rights as shareholders and additional income from dividends, worth, according to one analysis, an average of at least $2,600 per worker per year at publicly traded companies. As far-reaching and transformative as Sanders' own proposal is, evidence suggests that there may be public support for taking it even further. In 2019, the survey found that the majority of Americans would support companies with more than 250 employees, transferring as much as 50% of their stock to worker funds, making them halfway worker-owned and worker-controlled. Beyond ESOPs and the funds envisioned by Sanders, there are, of course, fully fledged worker cooperatives, companies directly owned and controlled by the workers. The worker cooperative sector in most countries is small. In the United States, it is possibly tiny. By one estimate, there are perhaps 1,000 such enterprises in America, employing some 10,000 workers. But cooperatives are nonetheless instructive, illustrating how much workers are capable of when left to their own devices, and how well democracy at work can function as a practical matter. Spain's Mondragon Corporation, for instance, perhaps the best-known collection of cooperatives in the world, employs tens of thousands of workers across some 95 firms in a variety of industries. In general, cooperatives as large as Mondragon, or much smaller, tend to be about as profitable and grow about as much as traditional companies, while offering the workers more job security. They do come with their own unique challenges. Worker congresses, like all congresses, do not always work well, and full participation in cooperative governance can demand a lot from workers. But they're a viable and democratically empowering business model, and we can do more to foster them. States can pass statutes laying out how cooperatives should be incorporated to help them comply with state laws built around more traditional businesses, and secure funding for banks. tax breaks and loans can be offered to help start cooperatives or convert existing businesses into them. And more worker ownership centers, like those in Sanderson's Vermont, could be founded with government support to offer them resources and technical assistance. Pursuing the agenda I've described here in brief, and there's a lot more I cannot get to in the time we have, would remake the American economy once again, this time to the benefit of America's workers, reducing inequality, improving the conditions of their working lives, and dramatically expanding the democratic agency in ways that will pay off not only at work, but in our politics. Empowering workers and unions and advocating on their behalf could hamper the anti-worker political activities of their employers, and putting more money in workers' pockets could facilitate democratic participation. But economic democracy would bolster political democracy in another way. Democracy, again, is a vastly complicated thing. Like all complicated things, engaging in it well takes practice. Habits and skills such as learning how to present and debate one's ideas, when and how to compromise, and how to critically assess and synthesize different sources of information before coming to a decision are critical for democratic life. Ideally, we'd be better at them than we seem to be today. We might improve if we give ourselves the chance to work on such skills more often, between and beyond elections. Economic democracy, whether through participating in unions, electing works councils, voting as shareholding workers, or working in full-fledged cooperatives, gives us the opportunity to hone those skills at work, where we come together with people often very different from ourselves to achieve things big and small. And through work, democracy can be made more concrete to those who've come to doubt it, understood materially as the means by which races can be won and problems in our daily working lives that trouble us can be solved, rather than as abstractions bandied about by politicians who always seem to promise more than they accomplish.
I feel like your book, and I think this is sort of the typical democratic socialist framework. We think of like citizen first, and I think in the war sort of called the New Deal, the neoliberal era, it's more citizen consumers, and I do wonder if there's a tension between the two. So, do Americans think of themselves as workers, or do they think of themselves as consumers? And so, if they think of themselves as workers, then all of the things you mentioned sound inspiring. If they think of themselves as consumers, then they might think all of the things you're mentioning make everything more expensive.
Right.
And we like the key word it seeing, in Democratic Party rhetoric is affordability. And so do you feel like that's in tension? I mean, every time we say, well, there should be union standards on a construction project or living wage paid to daycare workers, the typical American in the consumer framework would say, wow, that's just going to make my life more muscle. And how do we thread that?
Great question. So in the first place, we are actually both. We are all both consumers, and well, not all of us, but most of us are consumers and workers at once. And I think, there are obvious trade-offs here. I mean, does empowering workers, expanding unions mean that certain costs go up for employers that then pass on to consumers in certain places? Yes. At the same time, if you actually read Abundance, and there's been a huge amount of conversation around it, both from people who have read the book and people who haven't, this debate we were having about whether, there are certain structural elements of the American economy that have led to higher costs. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are very straightforward in saying, Europeans have much higher, labor representation, labor power, etc. And they can do some things we can't. They've managed to cut some costs we haven't been able to here, even though workers are far less empowered. So it's a more complicated story than, well, yeah, if you do this, everything becomes dramatically more expensive. The hope, obviously, in part, is that if people are paid more at work, people have more stability, financial stability provided by the fact that they're getting compensated for the labor they're doing, that eases some of the tensions and some of the stressors that make affordability has made supportability such a watchword. So anyway, I think that there's a balance to be struck always between consumer side needs and worker side needs, and I just think that the balance in the United States is dramatically out of whack in the wrong direction. I think that the places where this increases costs and the extent to which it increases costs and so on, that's I think a subject for further study and examination and debate. But a country where workers have as little power as they do in the United States, relative to peers that are wealthy and are growing and so on, that there's there are questions to be raised there. I hope the book raises for people.
So I was reading your book over Christmas break alongside Sohrab Amari's book, A Tyranny Incorporated. And there was a lot of commonality between the two books. And so I was curious your view of this nascent pro-worker right that maybe Sohrab would think of himself as part of. You might think also someone like Orrin Cass. Do you think of them as allies in sort of democratizing the workplace?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm kind of fortunate to align with the ideology Sorb has chosen for this year. I don't know that there's much consistency with him in particular, but you have seen a little bit of a boomlet on the right in at least populist rhetoric. I saw actually here.
I would say pro-worker again. I don't know how sincere.
So actually,
Like Josh Hawley, for
right. I saw actually in the schedule here that you either had or will have somebody from American Compass I actually know pretty well, Chris Griswold, who I think is that think tank, American Compass, is like the most serious entity on the right now, trying to rethink their labor policy, other policies in a pro-worker direction. Um, and by my estimation, they have the support of about 3.5 people in Congress. They have Josh Hawley, they have a couple other people you could name, but there's not been a real constituency and a real kind of policymaking apparatus within the Republican Party and within Congress to match the heatedness of some of the populist rhetoric we're getting. My evaluation of Donald Trump is that we have a very chaotic trade policy, and otherwise there's a lot of continuation of the kinds of Republican policymaking we've seen in the past on most fronts. I do think it is very interesting, let's say, and it should be a shock and a shame to progressives that Donald Trump has moved first to broach the issue of taking shares of major companies. It's a little strange. Is he doing it for pro-worker reasons? No, but it's that's another area you could say that there's something different going on. But I think that the lion's share of policymaking we've seen from this administration and from Republicans in Congress and state legislatures you don't really see that departure really being substantiated. So I don't know. We'll see where it goes. It's kind of early days yet, but I in a war between the Chamber of Commerce and Republican, pro-family, pro-worker nerds, I bet on the Chamber of Commerce.
So you're in a university, we train our students, maybe to go on and be good technocrats in governments here or abroad. What is the role of technocratic training in your vision? So it's just one example. There's increasing talk that the Fed may no longer be insulated from politics. From a economic democracy standpoint, the Fed is an incredibly suspicious institution. The thought that one of the some of the most important decisions that with a flip he can turn the unemployment button on are by design kept out of the reach of democratic debate. Right. So what is the role of something like the Fed, which is not a topic you, if I remember correctly, in the book, or other sort of technocratic functions of government in a world with more economic democracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I do wrestle with in the book is just the question of expertise and distributed labor. And, I obviously argue for more democratization across, our political system and our economy and so on, but I also take seriously, as I think we must, the fact that there's certain roles in politics and the economy that are left to specialists, and they can be made accountable in certain ways, and the public can have its say in certain ways. But when it comes to setting interest rates, do I want a national referendum on no, not exactly. I think there's a balance again. There's a balance that have to be struck here. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, the role of technocratic expertise, I think it's something that's denigrated excessively on the left, I would say. In fact, I just saw, yeah, well, yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, though, I mean, so I was about to say, I just there's this interview with John Stewart did with Richard Thaler that's been going around for the last week or so, right? I'm sure people have talked about it here. John Stewart, is he on like the left? No, he's just sort of generally little whatever. But I think he voices a lot of ideas that you will find a lot in progressive spaces. That all economics is, a kind of smokescreen aimed at, fostering and implementing the neoliberal agenda and so on. Look, I mean, I went to the University of Chicago, and even there, I don't think that was true. I think that if we really have these high aspirations, as a movement, we want a country where people universally have access to healthcare. We want strong labor movements. We want this, that, social provision, and so on. Uh, Implementing those goals, fulfilling those goals, is going to take a lot of deep knowledge and study and care and experimentation and so on. And um, that's what people come to places like this to learn how to do and do well. You can't vibe your way towards equality and powerful work, because you do have to, I think, turn your attention to data and um, learn how to interpret it. And I feel like economics, at its best, offers people the tools for doing that. So I would say in general, I am not among the people who say, or everybody who works in the federal government, this is just kind of an unnecessary, incrustation that prevents us from actually having direct democratic say on everything that's happening. I think democratic accountability is important, representation is important, but I also think one of the things that we should hope democracy allows us to do is to vote people in who set up an apparatus and appoint the right people who do what we hope them to do. A lot of that behind the scenes in ways the public can't understand. If we don't get the right results, we can change out leadership and they'll appoint different people. And I think that's totally consistent and compatible with democratic ideals.
So I have a few more questions, but I will open it up for now, and maybe I'll sneak in a few more questions later.
Thanks for the great talk, Elliot Mamet. I'm a postdoc at SPIA. Could you talk about your vision of democracy for the 4 million Americans who live in Washington, D.C. and the territories? I know it's elsewhere in the book, but I'd love to hear you talk.
I would love to talk about that. Yeah, so I think there's a lot in this book that's really actually quite complicated, and that allowed me to read a lot of theory, and it sort of twisted my brain cells up and so on. And there's a lot that I have to work through and figure out how I felt about. The situation of DC and the territories is not complicated. This is 4 million people, as you say, who are governed directly by the federal government with no actual say in governance beyond, in the case of DC and Puerto Rico and I guess all the territories, that they have a non-voting representative in the House, and they can speak, but they cannot pass or cast a final vote in passage of legislation. That flouts basic democratic principle. If you think democracy is about agency, about governing, having the ability to govern yourself, that situation that we take entirely for granted is totally untenable, and there are real consequences for it. In DC, I mean, we've seen that city subject to a lot of abuse by members of Congress from other parts of the country who want to make a point and show off that they can be mean to DC and reject their policies on drugs or abortion or what have you. Puerto Rico is functionally living as a colonial entity in this country. It's I mean, the Super Bowl performance that we all have heard about. I mean, the substance of that is this is a country that is well behind where it ought to be for a given real either independence or real representation in Congress. There are power outages and debt situation that was managed horribly by this country. It's not acceptable if we care about and we believe in democracy. So I've advocated for it in the book. In DC's case, I think they made their intentions quite clear over many years. I think the people of DC, can be said quite straightforwardly, would support statehood and joining this country. There would be some kind of legal battle about that for sure. The Constitution establishes DC as its own independence district, although there's a really kind of simple workaround to that. It is that the Supreme Court can agree that workaround makes sense, maybe not. But it's worth putting out there. It's worth advancing as a priority in the ways that Democrats, I think, haven't. The other territories, I think we should have representative referendums. I mean, Puerto Rico has had several now, and statehood tends to win out, but they're not very representative. Most people don't tend to participate, as far as I know. So having real, full, well-funded referendums in each case that, if the territories would like, puts them in the path of statehood, I think would be great. For people who don't know, statehood does not take a constitutional amendment or anything like that. It's a simple act of Congress. If the Democratic Party were to take this up as a priority, they controlled House, Senate, presidency, and they took this step. I also talk about eliminating the filibuster, which is ridiculous in ways that we can't get to. They could add new states to this country, and that's how states have been added in the past.
I really enjoyed the talk. You talked a lot about economic democracy and a way to democratize corporations and the economy. And you referenced the New Deal era, right? And so, but that process in the New Deal era, they tied economic democracy to kind of partisan democracy too, right? To mobilize those workers through the CIO, and then they became regular voters for the Democratic Party, right? There was a clear connection there. Do you think that's still possible today? The Democratic Party has shifted a bit on its economic priorities. They still have a kind of a worker-driven approach that is going to bring back all those voters who might have been tempted to go to Trump?
I don't think I'd say they have a worker-driven approach. I think they could. I think that you're right to suggest that these kinds of reforms could build up the kind of political infrastructure that they benefited from the New Deal and Great Society era. It's one of the reasons why I think it makes sense, even beyond normative reasons and the material reasons. If you are interested in building democratic power, to accomplish all kinds of policy aims, I think that this slate of reforms should be compelling. But I don't think, there's much energy around it right now. One of the reasons why I wrote the book was to start that conversation. And we'll see. I mean, that brief moment in 2019, 2020, when people were advancing all kinds of, I was talking to somebody today about how different that moment is. People are talking about job guarantee and the Green New Deal. And now it's like, are we going to partially defund the secret police force or not? So it's a different moment, but back when these ideas were being proposed, there was a lot of energy around them. There was a lot of polling that was being done that showed that because these ideas were so novel and they hadn't been freighted with, 10, 20 years of political, partisan, negative messaging, people took them, at face value and were like, is this a good idea or not? And on the job guarantee or some of these labor reforms, Americans were surprisingly willing to embrace things that were actually substantively quite radical, which I think is an opportunity space. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in this realm of policy, as important as I think social welfare policy is and social democratic reforms are, is that Americans have heard all of that other stuff, right? And we haven't really gotten anywhere. And I do think that the extent that we've been able to succeed in implementing social democratic reforms in this country in the past, it's rested on top of labor infrastructure that's now atrophied. And so I think we've kind of got the model backwards. I think it's now time to say we've tried, 50 years of, pushing Medicare for all, and I support Medicare for all, and I think we should keep pushing. But leading with that has not actually accomplished the thing. So what do we do that actually builds up the power for us to accomplish that goal and all the other goals, while also along the way making life a little bit better for workers? I think that labor policy might be the thing. The other thing I keep forgetting to mention. We are very fiscally constrained right now, in ways that we wouldn't have been, let's say, in 2009, 2010, 2011, when I first started reading Paul Krugman about this stuff and so on. The situation is different, and so the ambition of passing a huge slate of social welfare policies, as we saw under Biden, even with the little he did, there are real costs and constraints there. The upfront cost of the PRO Act to the federal government is $0, right? And, there are costs, second order, third order, we can talk about, evaluate, assess. But when it comes to having the fiscal space to implement changes that impact people's lives directly, while also building up political power you're talking about, that seems like a pretty good deal. I don't know. I think there's a lot of reasons why this kind of flip towards being labor forward makes sense in this moment. And I just kind of wonder if as we move towards 2028, people start to agree. We'll see. Yeah, I mean, I think it's should be easy to make the argument now that workers of all stripes ought to have some say in how this technology is being implemented. Both as workers and consumers, right? So, and we're seeing bits and pieces of those kinds of agreements come together. I mean, I think so. writer's strike, the culmination of that a couple of years ago was an agreement, and this is kind of analogous to sectoral bargaining just because of how weird the writing labor infrastructure is. But they made agreements about the use of AI or hope to make agreements on the use of AI in filmmaking as a kind of master whatever agreement that bound the industry. I think that those kinds of efforts make sense now. Yeah, I mean, you'd hope to see a regulatory push coming down from the federal government in the next administration. But even beyond the side that, I do think that this is a moment where one of the many, many concerns that we should be having about artificial intelligence is the extent to which it erodes labor rights. And the other thing, too, is that, I'm sorry, I forget what your name is. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, we were talking earlier today because you do research on job guarantee in the WPA and New Deal era. We were talking about this moment again in 2018, 2019, 2020 about, when people were starting to resurrect the job guarantee. And one of the things I said was, back then, you would hear from people who said, yeah, you could do a job guarantee, but you could also do basic income. And you should do basic income because that was those are the rival ideas. And so much of the push for basic income was being driven by the tech industry. And at that point, 8-9 years, yeah, it still is. But at that point, it was like speculatively in the next, let's say 20, 30 years, we'll come to a point where something might happen with the economy and we'll need some kind of, basic income to sustain it. Now it's literally every day within the next 18 months, nobody will have a job, and those claims are overblown. But I think that one of the things that should be interesting about a job guarantee now, not to fully resolve the argument or anything, is that it preserves human labor, right? So the basic income scheme now, or that proposal now, is a proposal that functionally allows the tech industry to do whatever conceptually, because you can just paper it over with a check. And whether it's normative reasons or social reasons, cultural reasons, so on, that you might want people to continue being employed, you then have an additional reason to say the job guarantee is something that we should maybe favor. I don't know. I think it's an interesting moment for that debate too, and I wonder where it goes. But truly, I could spend another hour and a half, 2 hours talking about AI here, and it's becoming more of an obsession for me. Yeah, maybe.
I think there was another part.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering a little bit about unintended consequences of some of the things you're proposing. So if we focus a lot, say, on benefits to employees, there will be racial effects and gender effects to those benefits because labor force participation rates for men and women are quite different. Overall employment rates across different racial and ethnic groups are quite different. One of the advantages of some of the social policies that we might point to is that they're far more universalistic. And so I can imagine, wouldn't necessarily be my position, but a critic saying, well, what you're proposing will really empower men considerably over women. The advantages will be disproportionately accrued to them because they work at higher rates. And so the benefits of focusing on this will go to them. It will also benefit white America at considerably higher rates. I'm curious what you think through some of those dynamics of employment targeted programs and given the structure of the American employment system, how this might have certain sets of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't think that these should be policies enacted in isolation. I think we still need a policy aimed at uplifting specifically, the conditions of minorities, women, and so on. So it's not like this is the end all be all. I do think it's worth more emphasis than to be given as a policy area than we traditionally offered it or afforded it. I don't know. I think that my take on that is, well, look, men are half the population, and they also deserve to be in the union, and so do white people. I think we're in a place too where like those kinds of like policy, those ways of interpreting policy, are also kind of being questioned. I think that there are distributional effects. At the same time, I think that there are African Americans and women and immigrants who benefit from these policies as well. And if more men tend to get more money because they work at higher rates, I don't think that's a reason to reject having stronger labor unions. I don't know. I just think, maybe people might raise those issues, but I think that if combined with a holistic policy agenda that also includes, childcare, that also includes housing policy, that also includes other, economic items that are aimed at people who are at the margins of American society, I'd hope that people are not so short-sighted that they would reject rights for workers at work purely because there is a kind of statistical benefit that accrues to certain populations. When we can, I think that the overall picture is one where I think all workers, including workers who are minorities and women, are advantaged. I don't know.
It's just to jump in. It is overwhelmingly white men who own capital, and to the extent that this is distributing from capital to labor, they're also the biggest losers in that sense.
So a lot has happened since you published the book. I was curious, I'm from New York, so you know what this next question is going to be, I'm curious about how local government and, election victories of people like Mamdani and Omar Fateh, of course, did not win his election, but like very, very left-wing, not very, but DSA candidates and local government kind of plays into how you're viewing, this.
Yeah, I mean, local government would have been a larger segment of this if I were doing it again and I had more time. Yeah, one of the debates I've really wanted to make a stronger intervention to is, what does democracy look like at the local level? Like, should we really have these public comment meetings, for instance, where it's 3:00 in the afternoon on a Thursday and the one person who shows up as a retiree is going to torpedo a housing development because it's going to kill some bird or something. That is that kind of democracy we find desirable. My argument there has always been that that's not really democracy. I mean, it's not. You don't have real representation, participation. There, it looks like democracy for certain, deliberative reasons, participatory reasons, but it's obviously deeply, deeply flawed. So reforming those kinds of institutions, I think, is a place where we could see more experimentation. I wish I could have spoken to that more. On the question of, I guess, the left in local politics, obviously I'm very glad Mamdani won. He's going to have a tough row to hoe in the next year. He's facing a lot of incoming, and it's going to be a very, very difficult job. I don't know, though, that there's any one candidate or any one political approach that ought to be looked at as the way that the left advances its position in this country. I think it's going to take a multiplicity of tactics and approaches and messaging strategies. But one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because I really thought that the democratic argument for worker power and representation, things that the left argues for, had been under-discussed and not made strongly enough to, liberals and people who aren't as far left, but who obviously have, as we've seen, this real energy and anger about the state of democracy broadly construed. To take that energy and say, well, if you care about that, you should also care about the fact that only 6% of private sector workers are unionized, would be a real accomplishment for the left. We'll see if it actually does anything. But I would say that even Mamdani, as successful as he's been, I would have liked to see, if I could, not that I have any room to critique anything, but I would have liked to see more labor forward rhetoric, policy, and maybe action now that he's actually in there. We'll see what comes of it. I don't know.
He's standing with the striking.
He's standing with the striking nurse. Yeah, people love standing in physical proximity to workers. Even Biden, Biden was one of the first. Like, yeah, I want to be in this physical place where workers are. But like actual policy making, I don't know. One of the other things I've been really interested in thinking through is, okay, like I've offered in that long spiel a picture of the federal dream policy agenda that, if I were sake, would say probably not going to happen anytime soon. So what is actually possible at the state and local level to build labor power, especially given that so much is preempted by the NLRA? And that's a question people are working through right now in California, New York, they've made the argument that NLRB is functionally a dead institution and they have to have the power, the right to enact labor policy on their own. That's going to be a legal battle we're going to see it play out in the next couple of years, I guess. But I'm really on the hunt for and thinking through, what are some of the institutions that we can utilize, underneath the kind of big aspiration to build bit by bit labor power that we're not already utilizing below the federal government. It's something I continue to explore, I think, in my future writing.
Dana, do we have more time? Did you have one more question yourself? Because you have a.
Do you think that the movement toward a more democratic economy goes to the Democratic Party? Do you think that you were even saying that there's a certain small d democratic energy among those who supported Trump. Do you think that one party or the other, purely in terms of the way they view their voters or the way they craft party leadership or primaries, is more committed to the small d participatory democracy?
Not at present. I kind of do think it has to go through the Democratic Party. I mean, I really wish that were not the case, but I think structurally there are a lot of reasons why third parties, alternative parties have not succeeded in America. It's not for want of trying, certainly on the left. There are 50,000 socialist parties of America, and they haven't done anything. So I think structurally the Democratic Party is only game in town. And the relationship you want to have is the kind of relationship the conservative movement has with the Republican Party. And that had to be built over time. It had to be built over time. And it wasn't just about winning primaries. It's about bringing more and more Americans over to that holistic way of thinking about policymaking and society. That took think tanks and publications and small policy efforts at the local level and so on. And they managed to build it. But, I think the Democrats, or rather what you might call a progressive movement on the other side, it really lacks the kind of connective tissue that conservatives have. It's very easy to describe to people what conservatism is. Limited government, personal freedom, free markets. You rattle off variations of the things. You've got the general picture. They can rope in all the different areas of policy that they're interested in and explain them in those terms. What does it mean to be progressive, actually? What unites our stances on climate change and abortion rights and immigration and healthcare, labor policy, and all? What is the connective tissue there beyond? There are groups we feel for and want to help, and we feel sad about, and we think the government should do stuff. It's much more amorphous, and I think that in the absence of that, it's very hard to build the kind of ideological institutions and ideological movement conservative movement is built. I think the thing could be democracy. I think that the ideal of agency that I described, where we are all entitled to a measure of control of the conditions that shape our lives, that's not just why we deserve political democracy and rights at work. It's also why you shouldn't be subject to a different justice system because you're a minority or you're poor. That robs you of the agency to live life at your own direction. It's why you shouldn't go bankrupt if you can't afford medical treatments, right? Or die because you can't afford medical treatments. It's why, frankly, if you live on the coast of Florida and a hurricane comes and knocks down your home, that should trouble you. That's a denial of your ability to live life at your own direction. There's some kind of ideal of agency that I think runs across, obviously, abortion rights. There's some kind of ideal of agency that I think runs across these different issue spaces that we're not very good at teasing out and talking about and presenting. But I think democracy is kind of the simplest way of thinking about it. It's a thing that ties it all together. And I don't know, I'm going to be thinking about that more, but I think you do need that kind of connective tissue to build the movement that then can bear upon a party with real strength. Until we have that and can build, if not a majority, a large constituency in America on that basis, then the Democratic Party is going to be inaccessible to us because we just won't have the votes.
There's one more question. So,
I've been talking a lot about your policy prescriptions in this Q&A, and I haven't read the book, so I'm kind of like assuming the weight of the book based on your presentation and the conversation. But why the focus on policy at all? Actually, if the issue is about labor power. Beyond the mere question of organizing unions and the right to form a union, would that be the kind of like primary prerequisite from which all these policy proposals would be subsequent? That is, you can't. Why is it left to the kind of intellectual to propose the policies as opposed to intervening on the organizational basis of democracy from whence the policy proposals should then emerge? I'm wondering how you thought about that balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a chicken or egg question. I mean, I think, perversely, doing a lot of things I talk about in the book that would be required to empower our labor unions would require labor organization to build up the political power, to change political state. Like, it's a circular thing. So yeah, it's not a book about organizing. It's a book for nerds or aspiring nerds to think about what we can do at the level of policy making, to, among other things, make the jobs of labor organizers a little bit easier. But no, I don't think that talking about that stuff is should be understood as a substitute for also needing to do the work of actual organizing, and as people are doing, people are trying. But the deck is stacked tremendously high against organizers and against unions. And so, like I said, I'm thinking about what can be done at the federal level to alleviate that, but also, what can be done close to the ground when we have these movements, to bolster them and facilitate that organization. That's just kind of the role that I think I have. But obviously, it takes organization to build up a power that I hope that we can utilize to implement these changes in the first place. Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay. So thank you so much. We do need to draw to a close. So thank you, Osita, for coming. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. I just wanted to put on your calendar or on your radar a few upcoming public talks, and some of them book talks. February 18th, we have Lena Khan, the former chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And so she will be here for a fireside chat. Am I? With me. I know with Deborah. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'll also be there for talking about economic inequality and the law. So that should be very exciting. March 26th, as Osita mentioned, we have the sort of more populist right pro-worker movement represented by the American Compass think tank. So the policy director from American Compass, Chris Griswold, will discuss American Compass's latest publication, The New Conservative, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. And then that's March 26th. On March 31st, Peter Conti Brown and Sean Bonetta will discuss their book, Private Finance, Public Power, A History of Bank Supervision in America. So please come out and join us for those future book events. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening tonight.